Part 2. The Terminator had lost a beat for a microsecond. Something overwhelming had caused him to black out, then awareness rapidly ballooned outward again. The static in his mind ebbed, the images swam into focus. There was an occulting mist around him, but he could see through it. The chronoporting had been nominal. He took in a breath and analysed it. It was the same here as there, with minor exceptions regarding pollutants and nitrogen content. He was curled into a fetal ball to increase the efficiency of the discontinuity envelope. He slowly rose up, maintaining perfect balance, as parts of his body adjusted. The carbonized conduction jelly had successfully buffered the epidermis from flashburn. The coating of white ash created a resemblance to classical sculpture, in white marble or alabaster, as awesomely perfect as Annie Barini or Rodin. The Terminator scanned the area for activity. A large metal object rested on asphalt 4 meters away. He locked onto the outlines and immediately recognized it as a GMC diesel refuse truck, circa 1975. The building beyond he identified a half-second later as the Griffith Park Observatory. Within another second, as all his senses began to function at optimal, he took note of the grounds, the weather, and the general geographic fix on his location, referencing against a map in his memory. He was on target. He turned his attention to the man in the truck. He was Negroid, approximately 50 years old, massing close to 150 kilos. His facial expression suggested fear, confusion, and temporary shock. Evidently, he was the operator of the vehicle he occupied. The temporal displacement had concussed the glass and burned out the ignition system. The Terminator focused on the man. By observing isolated and subtle body movements, he could estimate the subject's behavior and immediately determined that the level of threat potential was extremely low. Just before the man lunged out of the cab, the Terminator predicted that possibility by calculating the direction of muscle contractions in the upper torso. While the rest of his brain and body came up to speed, the Terminator observed the man run across the parking lot. He could have overtaken him easily, should he have thought it necessary, but the subject was neither a target nor a hostile. The naked man took a tentative step and found he was in complete control of all motor functions. He walked to the edge of the parking lot and looked out on the city below. A map from his memory overlaid itself on the scene below. Los Angeles. He became aware of the streets and their names and began accumulating options. The Terminator reviewed the events since his arrival in minute detail and caught an error. He was naked. He needed clothes. The black man had clothes. He should have taken the black man's clothes. Options crowded his thinking now, and he realized that this was a city filled with people. He would find one of suitable size and configuration, and then the error would be corrected. He turned back to the cityscape below, a powerfully built man with a near-perfect physique, naked in the 42-degree wind, and studied the relief map of Los Angeles, planning 100 strategies, charting 1,000 pathways, and accumulating valuable environmental data before setting off on his mission. Mark was on his feet now, the chemicals in his blood fueling him like a hydraulic puppet to walk towards Kotex and Rick. He wanted to grab the world by its balls and yank with all his strength. Settling for Kotex, he grabbed the chain epaulets on his jacket and spun him in a frenzied arc, slamming him into the steel railing that ran along the parapet. His fists and feet swung with the backbeat as Kotex came off the rail, and they slammed together in a fraternal frenzy. They spun together in a sweaty embrace and crashed into the coin-operated telescope that had been absorbing Rick's attention. Rick laid his half-empty beer bottle across the back of Mark's head, and he went down in a spray of foam and glass shards. Then, a judiciously applied combat boot sent Kotex reeling off balance onto the tape player, which crunched and stopped cold, echoes of fear slapping back off the observatory building, diminishing to silence. Rick glanced up from the eyepiece of the telescope that he had trained across the empty parking lot. His slack, astonished expression changed to a leer of malignant good humour. "Hey," he said, calling jovially for their attention, as if he hadn't just cracked a beer bottle over anyone's head. "Hey, what's wrong with this picture?" He made a frame with his hands, as movie directors wearing ascots and pork pie hats always did on TV, and Mark looked to see what he was framing. And his face went slack too. Kotex looked for a long time, as if his eyes weren't focusing. Then he giggled. It was one of those guys whose bodies you don't believe, wearing lots of sunscreen and a little Speedo bikini down at Muscle Beach in Venice. Except this guy didn't have the Speedo, and it was 42 degrees, and raining, and the middle of the night. "He's walking right up to us, man," Kotex said, closing ranks with the other two. Rick moved forward from the telescope, letting the soles of his GI boots drag with a laconic, dull sound, as he did when he was feeling gnarly. "Let's fuck him up," he hissed over his shoulder. Mark saw the grin, and knew they were about to mainline trouble. The naked man was striding straight towards them, his gaze unwavering. Mark felt a premonitory chill, and so apparently did Kotex. He said, "Hey Rick, cool your jets, man. This dude's really fucking enormous." Rick turned to him contemptuously. "These guys are fags, man. They pump for the mirror. They can't fight, trust me. Watch this." Kotex grinned. He was buying it, but Mark sensed something in the stranger's deliberate stride and expression that made him uncertain. Rick's hand went into the pocket of his artfully ripped overcoat. That was the signal, and Mark and Kotex gripped their knives surreptitiously. Mark's hand was sweaty, and his brain buzzed with fear and electric exhilaration. If he backed away, there would be no rejoining. He would be out. He didn't want to be out. He stepped forward. The naked stranger's bare feet slapped on the wet asphalt. Rivulets of rain had washed down the white ash in a pattern of streaks as complex as wood grain, giving him now the appearance of Renaissance statuary that had been exposed to the elements for centuries. He stopped in front of the three punks, arms at his sides, parade rest. They sauntered apart, flanking him, casually threatening. Rick's death's head grin appeared. "Nice night for a walk," Rick commented. The stranger glanced calmly from one to the other, taking in, giving nothing out. He looked directly at Rick and said, "Nice night for a walk." But Mark got confused, because it sounded a lot like Rick, only Rick wasn't talking now. The stranger was. The trouble with drugs was that you were never really sure if something weird was really happening. So far, this shit was high on the weirdness scale. Rick was shifting his weight jauntily. "I got it," he said, a sudden light bulb idea. "It's wash day tomorrow, huh? Nothing clean tonight, right?" Mark had to laugh then, despite the ice-cold snake that somebody had dropped down the back of his shirt. Rick was too much. "Nothing clean tonight, right?" the big guy echoed. Mark thought dully, is he fucking with us? What if he's a martial arts guy, and this is his idea of fun? Take off all your clothes and go kick some ass. Mark gripped the pearly handle tight. "I got your pearly gates, pal." Kotex, with a drooly grin, reached out and snapped his fingers several times in front of the stranger's face. The intense gaze remained unbroken. He didn't blink. "Hey," Kotex ventured, getting into the spirit. "I think this guy's a couple of cans short of a six-pack." "Your clothes," the stranger said flatly. "Give them to me." This was so unexpected that even Rick was caught off guard. His grin faltered, then came back, spread all around his face. "Now," the stranger commanded, his stare rigid. Rick's grin dropped, like a door slammed shut by a cold wind. "Fuck you, asshole!" "Shit, here we go," thought Mark. Rick's blade snapped out, glinting in the fluorescence under the big guy's chin before Mark's hand could move. Then he and Kotex had their switchblades out, snapped with drill team precision, and brandished. Very clean, very scary, guaranteed. Except the weightlifter wasn't registering quite the degree of slack-jawed fear they had hoped. In fact, he merely glanced from one to the other, without expression. Mark felt something was really wrong. Then a baseball bat smashed him in the face, and as the world spun around, he knew that it had been the stranger's fist, moving impossibly fast. He hit the railing and slumped, but looked up in time to see Kotex catapulted backward by a second pile-driver blow. Then he flopped to the ground, unmoving. Broken, Mark knew. Dead. Rick fainted and lunged, piling his weight behind the point of the blade. It sank to the hilt in the man's belly, but it seemed to hit something hard, like a rib maybe, except how could there be a rib just below his navel? Rick jerked back, hand and blade bloody, to try again, when the Terminator's fist blurred into him. Into him. Mark saw the naked forearm sink up to the elbow, just below Rick's sternum. Rick's eyes bugged as the wind was driven out of him, more in amazement than pain. The Terminator lifted his arm like a hydraulic jack. Rick's boots dangled off the ground, swaying like a hanged man's for one dilated instant. There was a muffled crunch of bones, and the Terminator's arm jerked back. Rick dropped, dead before his face smacked into the concrete. Reached in and ripped his spine out, a voice screamed in Mark's brain. Then the stranger turned to him, gaze riveting. Looking into those eyes was like looking up the muzzle of a gun. Mark stumbled, backing up as the stranger advanced. Mark couldn't tear his gaze from the man's arm, coated with blood to the elbow. Rick's blood. Punched into him and... Mark was blindly moving backward, smack against a chain-link fence. He turned to go in another direction, and saw that he was in the corner on the far side of the observation platform. The man stepped up to him. Mark had the sense to start ripping his clothes off. He held out the coat as an offering, as a shield, as a desperate plea that maybe he could get a little more time. Time to get away. Get down off this mountain, get into bed, pull the covers over his head and wake up. He was right. The offering did buy him time. About 14 seconds.